Hi, I'm Jim Hall, and welcome to another edition of Cult Pop. Today we've got Jeff VanderMeer on. I'm sure you're familiar with Jeff. A lot of great works out there. City of Saints and Madmen, probably the most famous. We're going to talk about that and so many others. The guy's a lot of fun, and this interview is a lot of fun. Jeff's down in Florida, we're here in Michigan, but we still put it together for you, and I think you'll really enjoy it. If you want to see this show again or watch any other of the Cult Pop shows, visit the website, www.cult-pop.com. You can check out all the shows there. So stay tuned for Cult Pop. Okay, I'm with Jeff VanderMeer, and Jeff, thank you so much for being on the show. Just pleased to have you all the way from Tallahassee, Florida. And I got to tell you, I just finished City of Saints and Madmen the other night and absolutely loved it. And
thanks.
I'm just starting Shriek and Afterwards, both novels set in ambergris, just an amazing world you've created. Very Tolkien-esque to me. It's just absolutely fantastic, the depth of a world you've created. If you would, why don't we start and talk a little bit about City of Saints and Madmen and that collection and the different novellas there inside.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. And yeah, City of Saints is probably the signature book. It's the one that a lot of people tend to recommend just by word of mouth to each other. It's just kind of got a life of its own at this point. And I think maybe it is in part because of the fact that it got so many different pieces that fit together. So everyone seems to have their own favorite as to what they like from it. It's a kind of strange, fantastical city though, because nothing fantastical really happens in it. That's probably one of the things about it that's unique. It's definitely another place, and it's definitely got its own culture and subculture, and it has these underground inhabitants called gray caps who were driven underground by the first settlers who basically took over the city, the first human settlers. And so that's kind of a weird, kind of Lovecraftian thing about it. But other than that, there's no magic, there's nothing really supernatural about the place. And in fact, I intended it to be kind of a echo or reflection of the real world, and so there's a lot of Byzantine history that went into the world building there. There's a lot of Venetian history, and basically it's meant to be kind of a mirror on the real world. And the thing that I like about that approach is that it kind of proves how strange our real world is, because a lot of times I'll get people, readers, emailing me and saying, well, Jeff, this part you made up is just amazing, and it'll turn out to be something. That part will be something I stole from Byzantine history around 1000 AD or something.
Well, I was certainly so impressed with the background, and when you start to read City of Saints and Madmen, when you first sent it to me, I was real interested because I look in and the book contains 4 novellas. It starts off with Drayden in Love, which is an incredibly kind of creepy, bizarre history tale, if you will, of the history of ambergris. And then a completely different story is the second, the Hoboken Guide to the Early History of Ambergris. So I liked how much the book, it's just you gave every different kind of story imaginable, from the first tale of a kind of a deranged guy to the second story is basically kind of a history tale, and then later on in the book you just got page after page of history and epilogue and different things going on, and that's why I made that Tolkien reference. Deep in such a history that I felt I'd stepped right in, picked up a history book of this wonderful planet you've created.
Well, I mean, Tolkien is certainly one of the influences, along with people like Italo Calvino and Borges. And I think the one thing I'd say first too is I'm glad you noted that Drayden from Drayden and Love was deranged, because I get a lot of readers, especially male readers, who actually think that he's sane. The female readers all think he's insane, like the worst date they might have ever had.
Right.
But a lot of male readers sympathize with him a little bit too much, and he is, of course, by the end, it's I think pretty obvious to most readers that he is insane. But the thing I like about the different approaches, and I wrote these stories over a period of years, and I meant for them to go together, but they were written over a period of 5 to 10 years, is that you do, like you say, you see the city from different perspectives, and sometimes you even see the city from contradictory perspectives, and I think that's how you see it in the real world too. You build up all the information you have about a place or a person from all these different sources, all of which are pretty subjective to some extent. And so you kind of have to form your own opinion and decide who you're going to believe about a person or about an event or anything like that. And so it's really an effective method of building a fantasy city or a fantasy world, because it's very much the way that we process information, in the real world.
Well, Jeff, I know you have to be absolutely thrilled to the response of City and Saints and Madmen. Won numerous awards both here and overseas. Yeah. So congratulations on all the accolades. As a bit of praise for me, I'd also like to mention that I like the fact that, as I mentioned, I feel at one point like you're reading a little bit of history, and then right out of the blue, incredible terror jumps out at you. What I'm speaking of specifically there, I was reading part of this book on a plane flight, and the mushroom cat people that you're talking about apparently ripped people's eyes out. And the way it was described that this guy lost his eyes was just incredibly creepy to me. Yeah. But it just took place very subtly in the middle of a great, fantastic story. So there's great examples of whimsical fantasy, history, and then sheer terror. So I think you've done an absolutely spectacular job, and I wanted to congratulate you, because it kept me up, and I went through it in about 3 or 4 sittings, and just absolutely loved it.
Well, it's funny, actually, you should mention that, because I started out in the horror field, and I started out, my first stories were pretty much supernatural horror stories. And I think that element still carries through into my fantasy, and I think it's what kind of grounds it or anchors it, because, like you said, some of it is kind of lighter whimsy, and if it was all like that, the place wouldn't seem that real. But the other thing about the gray caps that I find interesting about them, because I don't even really know everything about them. As a writer, you want to kind of explore and discover things as you go along. So I know a lot about them, but I don't know everything yet. But what I like about them is their motivation is so inscrutable at this point. You can see that they have kind of their own view of the universe, and you can even see, even with the eyes thing, that they may not have meant it personally.
Right.
That to them it may just be part of something else that's not even that malicious. And that, I think, is what makes it creepy too. Because really what's happening is the human beings in City of Saints are coming into contact with an alien culture. And it could as well be said in outer space, and having them exploring another planet in that regard, in a way.
Well, Jeff, there's so much to talk about that I'm going to move on from this, but I'm going to close talking about City of the Saints with this little side note for you. A friend of mine is a big China Melville fan.
Oh, yeah.
And we're quite close. He reads a lot of the same type books I do. And as soon as I finished this, I said, I just read something that's better than China Melville stuff. You're absolutely going to love it. So I'm helping spread the word of how great your stuff is. And I think you're the type of novelist and author that's going to just, as the years go on, get more and more and more fans from word of mouth.
Well, thank you.
But again, congratulations on City of Saints and Madmen. And now followed up by the brand new, biggest and best thing you got going on now, Shriek and Afterword. And Duncan Shriek is a character that is in the first book, and his mom is a famous kind of art proprietor and art dealer, and then she's kind of the person telling the story here.
Yeah, his
in the
sister,
second,
actually, yes. Yeah.
Novel, Shriek and Afterward. Why don't we talk a little bit about that, your newest novel out right now?
Right. Well, it's first of all, it is the first. It's the first long novel I've written, and it's really the first novel set in ambergris, because City of Saints is composed of novellas and stories that kind of interlock together. So it's got a different texture. It's also a first-person narrator, which makes things different, slightly more informal. But it's basically a 60-year history of the city seen through the eyes of Janice Shriek and her brother Duncan Shriek. And Duncan's this alternate historian, kind of like the historians you might find today, or actually the fringe historians you might see today, who have all these theories of, like, alien invasion of the Earth back in the Mesozoic era or something, and cave paintings actually show aliens and stuff like that. That's who he's kind of grouped in with in the city of Ambergris. The tragedy of that is that this message that he's bringing about the Grey Caps and what they're really up to is actually true, but he's completely discounted by his peers and by the people of the city throughout. And so you have that thread, and then you have Janice Shriek, this art gallery owner who reaches these huge thresholds of success beyond anything that she's known before, and really can't deal with it. And so you have those two different stories, which are semi-tragic. And then you have the history of the city itself coming to the surface, in that halfway through there's a war that starts in the city, basically a civil war that tears the city apart, with the Grey Caps supplying arms to one side and not to the other. And so you have these scenes that, to me, again, kind of echo the real world, but are totally, at the same time, strange. They kind of show you the strangeness of the real world. Like, in one case, the Grey Caps, they basically sell fungal bullets, mushroom bullets, to one side. And the thing about these bullets is, after you fire them, they're inert and they're edible. And so in parts of the city, there are people who are basically digging these bullets out of their loved ones to eat, because it's all that's left, to survive.
Right.
And so you have, I think that something like that kind of brings home the horror of war, while still kind of keeping it definitely in the fantasy realm. And so you have this backdrop of what the city does to people, and then how Janice and Duncan are trying to basically survive in this setting. And what I really wanted to do with these characters is, City of Saints is somewhat stylized. As I was saying to someone, it's like, you get into the characters in City of Saints, but you can't ever see maybe them going down to the corner store to get a jug of milk or something. They're not that kind of people. And so in Shriek, it's kind of like these are just ordinary people trying to get on with their lives in a fantasy setting, and extraordinary things are happening around them that they get caught up in. And it's definitely a different texture. I mean, there are those readers who have emailed me and said, we love this and we don't like City of Saints as much, and then vice versa. So it's definitely a different texture from City of Saints and a different approach.
Well, I'm just starting Shriek, but I'm definitely looking forward to that. And as you said, it's a complete novel.
Right.
I thought what was so neat about City of Saints and Madmen is when you sent me the novel, when you first get it, I was wondering, well, what is this? Because it looks like part history novel, and then there's afterwards and five or six different stories and all that. So it's really amazing. And then you get Shriek, and it's just, here is a novel. So some of your fans are probably thinking, hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
But you've created such an amazing world. I know that you've got Finch is a novel that's set in the same world. And is this a world, Jeff, where you plan to continue to write for many years to come?
Actually, back in until this year, I had a full-time day job of 40 to 60 hours a week. And so when I came up with the whole novel cycle in basically in 1998, I wrote Drayden in kind of like a dream state. I mean, I wrote it from beginning to end, and it's almost exactly as I wrote the first draft, which is insane. It's like it just came to me of a piece. But then I had to figure out, well, what is Ambergris, and how does all this stuff fit together in a logical way if I wanted to do more stories? So in 1998, I wrote the rest of the stories for City of Saints, and I came up with a novel sequence, of which Shriek was the next one after City of Saints, and then Finch has turned into the third. And after that, there's kind of an epilogue to everything that may be a novella, may be a novel, called the Zamalon File, which is actually a series of secret documents, actually literally presented as if you're looking at the secret files of some Secret Service agency.
Oh, cool.
And so you kind of piece the story together yourself. But Finch, the next one, is actually a detective novel set in Ambergris, and it's set about 500 years after Shriek. And in it, the Grey Caps have come above ground and taken over the city and placed half the population in concentration camps and put the other half to work building two huge towers out in what is now a harbor, because what they've done is they've flooded parts of the city and they've created this bay. And you've got this, and then you've also got basically a rebel human population fighting back against this. And in the middle of this, you have Finch, this John Finch, this detective, who is charged by the Grey Caps with solving this impossible crime. And he's working for them because he has no choice. He can either work for them as a detective or he can be sent to the camps. And so he has this situation where if he solves this impossible crime, the rebels are going to basically off him. And if he doesn't, the Grey Caps are going to get rid of him. And so the pressure just slowly mounts throughout the whole novel. And I like it because, again, it's totally different from Shriek or City of Saints. And it involves my love for noir fiction, because I read a ton of mysteries and just love that genre. And so I thought combining fantasy and mystery, and then also by having it take place so many hundreds of years after the events in City of Saints and Shriek, it more or less means Ambergris is a different place, so I don't get tired of writing about it. I have to kind of reimagine what it would be like that much later.
Sure, it's amazing with the place you've created that you can write a noir fiction piece. You can write just about anything you want because you've created this amazing world.
Yeah, exactly. So as long as I can continue to have different approaches and ways of looking at it, I think I'll write about it, even though I probably won't do any more novels after Finch, and then the next one it might just be some stories. But I'm already starting on a new cycle of stories as well. So. Okay,
fantastic. Well, I know readers will definitely be looking out for those books. Now, you've got another novel out, Veniss Underground.
Yes.
It's not an Ambergris novel. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that one?
Well, that was actually the first novel that I wrote, and I wrote it back when I was about 25 years old, and I sent it around everywhere, and it got completely rejected. And it's basically set in a far, far future society that's more or less under attack from elements of itself, because bioengineering has been so successful that certain species, like a certain kind of meerkat crossed with gorilla and kangaroo genes, kind of like an uber meerkat, has been developed as a servant class, and they are basically revolting. And there's an underground there too, oddly enough. It's a different kind of underground.
You like the underground, don't you?
Apparently, it's slightly different. You know, in City of Saints, you don't actually really see what's going on there that much. In Veniss Underground, the protagonist who's trying to save his ex-girlfriend, who's been basically kidnapped for parts at an organ bank below ground, where there's this total lawless society of mutants. When I say it that way, it sounds like a B movie of some kind. But he has to go. He has to go underground to save her. So you see all the different levels of the city. There's even the villain of the piece even lives inside the jaws of this giant fish who lives in this huge lake, 33 levels below the surface. And so that allowed me to kind of play with science fiction as fantasy, because it's so far future. The science of it really isn't relevant, you know. I mean, it's really more like a science fantasy, kind of like Jack Vance or something. So that what was interesting about that is that it got rejected the first time around, because at that particular moment in time when I was sending it around, China Mieville and that kind of fiction hadn't come around yet, so people didn't really have a way to kind of classify it sales-wise.
Right.
And it's funny, it's just ironic, because I sent it around for so long, and then I just basically put it in a drawer and figured, well, this must be awful. And then in around 2000, things started to break differently. City of Saints came out, and then suddenly Mieville's Perdido Street Station came out, and Veniss came out to pretty widespread acclaim, was a World Fantasy Award finalist, and got tons of great reviews. And that's kind of been the story of my career. It's like the more the 90s were not good to me in terms of that kind of thing, and the lesson I learned was just to kind of persevere and be true to your vision, and eventually you'll win out, basically.
Well, Jeff, that's kind of the next thing I wanted to talk about. You're just not a guy that stumbled onto success out of nowhere. You've been plugging away at writing for 15 years or so, and I knew your name, and at first I couldn't figure out why when it was mentioned that we'd get you on the show, and I realized I'd read some of your books that you have edited. And you've got 2 books coming out here rather shortly, The Best American Fantasy.
Yes,
that's coming out soon. And
the first volume of that is out now, yes.
And you've got a steampunk anthology that you're also editing. So why don't we talk a little bit about those and your other editing works?
Sure. Well, I started out editing a poetry journal back in the 80s, and then edited a series of anthologies called Leviathan, which were original fiction anthologies that combined fantasy fiction and mainstream realist fiction. some of them just had basic themes. Like one had Into the Gray as a theme, which was kind of like, adventure fiction, but it could be psychological adventure, it could be, realistic physical adventure, whatever. And now we're branching out into these other anthologies. The Best American Fantasy, the idea behind that is you have some anthologies like Year's Best Fantasy and Horror that cover the field very well, but they can't devote enough space, I think, to North American fiction. And there are so many magazines out there, so many literary magazines and genre magazines, that there's a wealth of stuff that doesn't get seen outside of the context of somebody who happens to pick up one of those magazines. And so we took a gamble and said, well, we'll start this series. It'll also be the first fantasy series with rotating editors. So after the second year, there'll be a different guest editor every year. We're only staying on the first 2 years, my wife and I, to kind of provide some foundation for the series. But the gamble paid off. There was a ton of material that was getting overlooked, not because of any real oversight on the editor's parts of the other anthologies, but when you focus in more specifically on something, you can basically devote more space to it, for one thing. And so we found a lot of stuff that really deserved reprinting, really exciting fantasy work, some by genre writers like Kelly Link and Elizabeth Hand, and then some really wonderful fantasy by Chris Adrian in the New Yorker and other places. So it's really cool that we have an anthology, A Year's Best, where you have a story by Jeffrey Landis from Analog right next to a story from the Georgia Review. And yet it makes sense when you read them. It's like, okay, yeah, this is all one continuum of fantasy.
Well, Jeff, as we're getting a little shorter on time, I want to make sure I get everything
Sure.
in. I'm certainly looking forward to the Best American Fantasy Anthology. That's been fantastic in previous years, so I can't wait to get my hands on that. Speak quickly on the steampunk anthology.
Oh, yeah.
I love the steampunk movement. Some people I've known and interviewed, Tobias Buckell and some other folks, are a big part of that movement. But I love some of the names that I've seen that you've pulled in for this anthology. Talk for a couple minutes on that, if you would.
Sure, absolutely. The steampunk stuff is so much fun to put together, because the stories are just so much fun. I mean, we're also doing a new weird anthology, which I really, really love, but the stories there are like very intense and dark, because there's definitely a horror element. But the steampunk stuff, we've got great work by Neil Stevenson, with a story that's kind of like part steampunk, part cyberpunk. So it's kind of at the end of the anthology is like the missing link. And we also have stuff by James Blaylock, Lord Kelvin's Machine, which is just an absolute classic steampunk story. We have stuff by Jay Lake, who recently had a novel out, Mainspring, which is very, very much steampunk. And we've got a wide variety of stuff. We have Mary Gentle, an English author, Ian R. MacLeod, and Molly Brown, who had a great story in this Jules Verne anthology that we were able to take out as a reprint. And trying to think of who else. It's just there's so many anthologies. We have actually 8 anthologies coming out next year.
Yeah,
so.
Just some names I scribbled down. You've got Joe R. Lansdale.
Joe R. Lansdale.
Moorcock,
His story
Ted
is absolutely amazing.
So I know that's just going to be absolutely fantastic, and that's another one I'll get my hands on. But before we run out of time today, Jeff, you've done something that I'm really, really impressed with. With the help of the band The Church, you've put together a little mini movie. So what we're going to do is take a little look right now. We're going to take a look at a clip, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
The rain was never the same after the war. The thing we call the shift began. Odd things come with the rain now, out of the sky. Things that seem like omens or portents. They lie struggling in piles of seaweed, as alien to the city as we are to the gray caps. We try to decipher what it might mean. No one has seen a gray cap anywhere for years, and yet we feel them everywhere. The shift has made people different. A war will change you, but by how much? Strange life, strange light. And yet how few people seem to see the change, really see it. I saw it just taking my walk. Saw it as I visited all the places that used to be my world, all the places I've been writing about in my little room with the green light, the dust-smudged window. Memories of floundering when you're already forever out of business.
Okay, Jeff, that was really very, very cool. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the movie clip we just saw?
Well, basically, the part of the movie that you've just seen takes place partly during the war that I talked about in Shriek and Afterword, with Janice Shriek basically under attack from a creature created by the Grey Caps. And then after that, there's a lovely little transition period into a section of the novel that's about the shift, which is after the war. Because of all of the fallout from the weapons that are being used and stuff, the city begins to change, the weather begins to change, strange creatures begin to appear just kind of in the alleyways and things. And so the other challenge with a movie like this is, do you do a literal interpretation? Well, first of all, if you're going to do a literal interpretation on a tiny indie movie budget, you're probably going to wind up with something that looks very cheesy. So, but you also, for all those readers who have a specific idea in their heads of what Ambergris should look like, we didn't want to do that either, because we didn't want to ruin their vision of what they thought the city was like. And so, as you can see from the techniques, we're kind of working in kind of a Eraserhead territory with a narrator as well. So we didn't have to employ a lot of live actors, which is also kind of a variable in small budget indie films that you have to be concerned about. So we used a lot of different.
Jeff, I'm going to have to cut you off there. We absolutely loved that. You've got a wonderful website where people are going to be able to see part of that movie, learn about all the books we've talked about. We've shown it throughout the show today, but why don't you tell the folks at home one more time your website where they can learn all about your works?
Well, it's jeffvandermeer.com or it's shriekthenovel.com. Both of those websites have comprehensive information. And the latest book actually is a little Christmas treat. We've put out a little book called The Surgeon's Tale and Other Stories, which is a collaboration with Cat Rambo. And there'll be information on that on my website soon, but it's just a little collection of folk tales that's the perfect little holiday gift that we thought would be nice for people. So.
Well, cool, Jeff. I want to thank you so much for being on the show. We've had a lot of fun doing this kind of intercoastal from Florida up here to Michigan. I would be remiss, however, if I let you go without mentioning your wonderful wife, Anne, is also the editor of Weird Tales and works a lot with you. So we give our best to your wife.
Thanks.
And we thank you for being on. We tell folks to pick up all of Jeff's books. Check out his wonderful wife Anne's work at Weird Tales.
Oh, yeah.
And Jeff, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much too, Jim.
Okay, folks, we thank you for watching Cult Pop. We remind you of the new website, www.cult-pop.com, and you can see all the episodes there. And we'll see you next time on Cult Pop.
What's it like when you hear your calling? Will you ignore it? Or will you listen? What if it calls you to go halfway around the world? To serve people you've never met? What will you do when you hear your calling? Peace Corps, life is calling. How far will you go?